I had been dead for the better part of 7 years, the way the county told it, and I knew it before I ever reached the bluff because a freighter on the Calder Road tipped his hat to me like a man tips it to a ghost, and then whipped his team faster than the grade allowed. I had come a long way to be a ghost. I had walked out of a prison camp in Carolina with my boots tied on with wire and a fever that took a stranger's wife 3 weeks of broth to break, and I had worked my way west by every low job a country lays out for a man with no money and a bad shoulder, splitting rails, mucking stalls, riding drag on a herd up out of the nations for a trail boss who paid in promises and one good coat. The coat was the only thing I owned that was worth a damn, and I had carried it across 4 territories so that, when I came up the lane to the place on Sweet Birch Creek, I would not come up it looking like the thing the county already believed I was. But a coat does not fix a face, and mine had changed. There was a seam over my left brow that the camp doctor had stitched with a needle meant for sacking, and there was a way I had of going still when a door opened behind me that no amount of coming home was going to cure quick. I knew all that. What I did not know, riding the last miles in the dark with the banner Hills a low black shoulder against the stars, was whether Adeline Crane was still on that creek at all, or whether she had done the sensible thing a woman does when her man rides off to a war and the war keeps him, whether she had married some steady fellow with 40 head and a sound roof, and was sleeping warm in a house I had no business riding up to. I had told myself for 7 years that I wanted her too. I had said it to the dark of the camp like a prayer turned inside out. Let her be married, let her be warm, let her have stopped waiting, because waiting on me is a poor way to spend a life. I believed it the way you believe a thing you cannot stand to picture. And then I would picture it anyway, some broad-backed rancher's hand on the small of her back at a church social, and I would lie there and hate him with my whole ruined heart, and hate myself worse for it. Let me go back. A man ought to lay the years down in order, even when his hands shake doing it. I came to Calder's Bluff the first time when I was 22, and had nothing but a horse named Pard and the kind of confidence that gets a young man killed 9 times out of 10 and married the 10th. I hired on at the Lessard outfit, north of town, where the Banner Hills break down into good grass, and I was a fair hand and a worse gambler, and altogether the sort of young fool I'd cross the street to avoid now. I met Adeline Crane at the spring branding, which is not a place a man expects to meet the whole rest of his life, but there she was, working the tally board for her father with a pencil and a flat, unimpressed look, while a yard full of men tried to show off for her and got nothing for it. I did not try to show off. I had seen what it bought the others. I just brought her a dipper of water when the dust got bad and the day got long, and I said, "You've miscounted by 2, ma'am, on account of those twins out of the brindle cow got run through twice." And she looked at her board and looked at the chute and saw I was right, and she fixed it without a word, and then she looked at me a second longer than she needed to. That was all, that second longer. A man could build a life on less, and I tried to. Her father, Eli Crane, ran a tight, poor, honest little homestead on Sweet Birch Creek, the place I am telling you about. He had come out with a wife who died of the birth that gave him Adeline and no other children, and he had raised that girl to ride and shoot and figure a ledger and keep her own counsel, because he had no son and no notion that a daughter couldn't do the work of one. By the time I knew her, she ran half that place and most of its books, and she did it the way she'd fixed my tally, quiet, certain, no fuss. She was not what the county called a beauty. She had a plain, straight way of standing and a mouth that didn't smile to be polite and brown eyes that saw clean through a man's foolishness to whatever true thing was underneath, if there was one. I have known since I was 22 that I would rather be seen clean by Adeline Crane than be loved blind by any other woman God ever made. I courted her 2 years slow, the way you gentle a horse that's been handled rough before, though she hadn't been. That slowness was mine, not hers. She had no patience for a man who couldn't say plain what he meant. She broke me of pretty talk inside a month. Don't tell me the moon's like my eyes, Whit Calloway. she said once, on the porch with her father pretending to sleep 10 feet off. "Tell me a true thing or don't say anything. I've got chores at 4. So I told her a true thing. I told her I'd never wanted a place of my own until I'd thought of her standing in the door of it. And that scared me worse than any wild horse. And I'd ride off the next morning if she wanted me to, but I'd be lying every mile. She didn't tell me to ride off. We were going to marry in the fall of my 24th year. We put a down payment on the quarter section that ran up against her father's, off the back of 3 good seasons and every dollar I hadn't gambled, and I'd quit the gambling clean by then. She'd not asked me to, which is the only reason I could. We had the timber felled for a house. I had cut and notched the sill logs with my own hands, and she had come up of an evening to sit on them while I worked and tell me where the window would go so she could watch the creek while she worked the dough. Then the war came up over the country like weather. I'll not bore you with which war or whose. The country has had enough of them, and from the inside they all look the same. Young men told a fine, clean story about why they ought to go and bleed, and the story turning out every time to be mostly mud and waiting, and the particular sound a friend makes when a thing that should not happen to a body happens to his. I went because the men I'd worked beside went, and because at 24 I still half believed the fine, clean story, and because, God forgive the vanity of it, I did not want to be the one man on the creek who stayed home while the others rode. Pride sent me. Plain pride. I have had 7 years in a prison camp to look at it square, and it was pride. The night before I rode, I sat with Adeline on the notched sill logs of the house we hadn't built, and I gave her the only thing I had to give, which was a promise. And a promise is a poor coat in a cold country, but it was what I had. "I'll come back," I told her. "Before the first snow flies, or the one after that at the most. I'll write you every week there's a man going to a post office, and you'll know I'm coming the whole time. And when I come up that lane you'll be standing in the door of our house, and we'll finish it together, and that'll be the end of all the leaving I'll ever do." She didn't cry. I have loved a great many things about that woman, but I think I loved that most that night that she didn't make it harder by going to pieces, because she knew I'd have stayed and she knew I had to go, both at once. She took my face in her 2 hands, which were rough from work and warm, and she looked at me with those clean brown eyes, and she said, "I'll wait, Whit, but you listen. I'm not waiting because I'm yours to keep on a shelf. I'm waiting because I choose to. If that ever stops being a thing I choose, I'll tell you plain and you'll have no call to argue. You understand me?" I said I did. I didn't, not all the way, not then. I was 24 and I heard I'll wait and let the rest go by. It took me 7 years and a long road home to understand what she'd given me that night was not a leash. It was a free woman telling me she'd keep choosing me as long as the choosing was hers to make. There is no finer thing a person can offer another, and I rode off the next morning too young to know I'd been handed the whole world on a porch in the dark. I wrote her every week. That is the thing I need you to believe, because she did not for a long time, and it near broke us both. I wrote her from the staging camps and from the long marches, and from the field hospital after the ball went through my shoulder at a creek crossing whose name I won't dignify. I wrote her left-handed for 2 months because my right arm wouldn't hold a pencil. I gave those letters to anyone headed back toward a post, sutlers, couriers, a chaplain with kind eyes who I am fairly sure drank them, the letters I mean, used the paper to start his cook fires, because not one of 40-some letters ever reached Sweet Birch Creek. A war is a great machine for losing things. It lost my letters and very near it lost me. I was taken at the end of the 2nd year. Our position was overrun in a fog so thick a man couldn't see his own outstretched hand, and I woke up a prisoner with my shoulder freshly ruined a 2nd time, and a 4-year education ahead of me in exactly how much a man can lose and still draw breath in the morning. I'll not walk you through that camp. It is enough to say that the men who kept their wits kept them by holding one true thing in the mind and refusing, every single day, to let go of it, the way a drowning man holds a spar. Some men held a mother. Some held a stretch of home country, a particular bend of river they meant to die looking at. I held a woman standing in a door that wasn't built yet, telling me she'd wait because she chose to. And I held it through 4 winters, and it is the only reason I am here to set this down. When the war finally guttered out and the camp gates opened, I was 30 years old and looked 40 and had no money to cross a country with. So I crossed it slow. I worked, the way I told you, rails and stalls and one long trail drive. And every season I told myself I'd write ahead to her, and every season I didn't. And I have asked myself 100 times since why a man who'd written 40 letters into the dark couldn't write one across a working telegraph line. And the answer is an ugly little one, but it's true. I was afraid. 40 letters lost is a thing you can blame on a war. But to send one clean letter down a good wire and get back silence, or worse, Mrs. Adeline Garner regrets, I could not have stood up under that. So I told myself I'd come in person or not at all, and I rode the long way home like a coward dressed up as a romantic, which is a costume a great many men have worn. Which brings me back to the freighter on the Calder Road, tipping his hat to a ghost. I came into Calder's Bluff a little before noon on a gray day in the back end of autumn, with the cottonwoods along the creek gone to rust, and a smell of coming snow in the air that put me powerfully in mind of the last time I'd smelled it, on a porch making a promise. The town had grown. There was a second church now and a bank with a real stone front and a mercantile twice the size of the one I remembered. Nobody knew me. I had banked on that and it still cut, every face that slid off mine like rain off a slicker. I tied up outside the mercantile to buy a few things I'd need, and to do the thing I'd been dreading the whole long road, which was to find out, from a stranger's mouth, what had become of her, before I rode up that lane and found out from her door. The man behind the counter was new since my time, round and friendly, glad of someone to talk at on a slow day. I bought coffee and shells and a paper of needles she'd used to favor, and I worked the talk around sideways the way you do, asking after the old outfits who was still on what range. And when I'd warmed him up I said, careless as I could manage, the old Crane place up Sweet Birch. Eli Crane, is he still on it? Crane, the man's face did a thing. Old Eli passed, 4 winters back now, hard winter, the one took half the stock in this valley. He shook his head. His girl's still up there though, Addie Crane, runs it herself if you can feature that, has done all these years. The floor of me dropped clean away. His girl's still up there, not Mrs. Garner, not Mrs. Anybody, up there running it herself all these years. By herself, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. By herself. He leaned on the counter, settling into it the way a talker does. It's a sad sort of story, mister, if you want it. She was promised years back to a Callaway boy, worked for the Lessards, good hand, everybody liked him. He went off to the war and never come back. Killed, most reckon, though there was never any word for certain, and that's the worst of it, ain't it, never knowing. Plenty of men come courting her after. She's not a hard woman to look at, and that's a fine piece of bottomland. And old Eli, before he died, he leaned on her something fierce to take one of 'em. Take the Hadley boy that had the place adjoining, sensible match. And she wouldn't any of 'em. Kept the man's coat hung by the door, the story goes, all these years, and kept the door. He stopped and looked at me, and something in my face must have finally told him, because he went the color of ash. Mister, he said slowly, what did you say your name was? I didn't, I said. I put a coin on the counter for the goods, and I think I thanked him. And I went out into the gray noon with my heart going like a green colt in a chute. And I got on my horse, and I turned him up the Sweet Birch Road. And I did not buy the rest of what I needed, because I could not have stood in that store one more second under the weight of kept the man's coat by the door, all these years. I'll tell you something I learned riding up that creek. A man can want a thing for 7 years, hold it like a spar through 4 winters of hell, walk across a continent toward it, and still, when it comes up close enough to touch, be near sick with the fear of it. Because as long as she was a door in my mind, I could not fail her. But she was about to be a real woman, 4 winters a orphan, 7 years let down by a country that ate her letters and a man who hadn't trusted her enough to send one clean line down a wire. and I was about to ride up and ask, with my scarred face and my bad shoulder and my 7 years of silence, to be allowed back into a life she had built, hard and alone and well, without me. The lane came up the way lanes do, all at once after going on forever. I knew it before I saw the house. I knew the bend of the creek and the particular cottonwood, bigger now, that we'd said would shade the kitchen side. And the house was there, the house, our house, the one I'd notched the sill logs for and ridden off and left a skeleton. It was finished. Finished and weathered and lived in, smoke standing up straight from a stone chimney into the cold, still air, a garden plot put to bed for winter, a tight pole corral with 3 good horses in it and a milk cow, a woodpile stacked square and high enough to laugh at any winter the Banner Hills could throw down. She had built our house, without me. Stick by stick over 7 years she had finished the thing we started, and she had lived in it alone, and she had kept the door. I want to tell this part right, because it is the part I'll carry to my grave. I came up the lane at the gray edge of the afternoon, not first light. The storekeeper had the dawn part wrong, the way a story gets one detail wrong on its way to being true. It was first light of the next morning that the county would later fix on, because that's when folks saw the smoke and the strange horse and came to look. But I came up the lane that gray afternoon, and the door of the house opened before I'd reached the gate, the way a door opens for someone who has spent 7 years learning the exact sound of a horse coming up her lane and learning, every time, that it wasn't the one. She stood in the doorway, older. Of course she was older, we both were. The years don't excuse a soul from their work. Gray come into her hair at the temples, and her hands, when she put one up against the doorframe, were a working woman's hands, harder than I'd left them. But she stood the way she'd always stood, plain and straight and certain, and she looked at me coming up that lane with those clean brown eyes that had always seen straight through to the true thing underneath. I got down off my horse at the gate. My legs were not entirely to be trusted. I took off my hat, because a man takes off his hat, and I stood there in the cold with 7 years and 40 lost letters and 4 winters of a door held in my mind, and I could not for the life of me find one word of the speech I'd built on the long road. She didn't move from the door. She looked at me a long moment, long enough that I felt every scar and every silent year laid out and counted. And then she said, in that flat, plain voice I'd carried across a continent, not soft, not yet just true. Her father, old Eli, had not taken my going well. He'd like me fine as a hand and a suitor, but a promised man who rides to a war and goes silent is, to a hard old practical homesteader, just a slow way of breaking his daughter's heart, and Eli had no patience for it. Inside the first year, with no letters coming, he'd started in on her to let me go. Inside the second, when the casualty lists ran long and no Calloway on them but no word either, he'd started in harder, and pointed her at Tom Hadley, who had the adjoining quarter and 40 head and a sound roof and a decent steady nature, and who had, to his credit, been honest and patient and never once unkind in his courting of her. Tom Hadley's a good man, she told me flat across the fire. And I made myself hear it without flinching. I'll say that to your face because it's true and you can stand it. He courted me 3 years, decent the whole time. Pa wanted it. Pa wanted it on his deathbed. Wit, that's a hard thing to set against, a dying father asking. He took my hand the last night and he said, "Girl, don't keep waiting on a ghost, marry Tom and be safe." Her eyes were dry, but they had a long way back in them. And I sat with him and I held his hand and I told him the truth, which was that I wasn't waiting on a ghost. I was waiting on a choice I'd made with my eyes open, and I'd not unmake it on hearsay and a casualty list with your name not on it. He died thinking me a fool. That's the hardest thing I carry, harder than the winters. My pa died thinking I'd thrown my life away on you. She looked at me. So you'll understand I have got a great deal riding on you not being a fool to have waited for. No pressure to you, she said, dry as a creek in August. And I laughed because she meant me to, because she had always known exactly when a thing had got too heavy to carry without a little laughing. The winter that took Eli was the one the storekeeper had spoken of, the hard one that took half the valley's stock. She'd come through it by being smarter and harder than the weather. She'd sold down early when she read the signs, against her father's wish, and so she'd less to lose and more cash by, and she'd brought the core of the herd through on hauled hay and pure stubbornness while richer outfits lost everything. That was the winter the homestead near went under, and the bank in town, the one with the new stone front, had come sniffing after her note, expecting to pick up good bottomland cheap from a grieving girl alone. And she had walked into that stone front bank in her dead father's coat and laid out her ledger, the ledger she'd kept clean and square 7 years, and showed them a homestead better run by a lone woman than its neighbors were run by whole families of men. And she had renegotiated her own note across the desk from a banker who'd thought to roll her, and she'd walked out owning her place free and clear inside 2 more years. And every spring of those years, Tom Hadley had asked her again, gentle, and every spring she told him no, gentle, until the spring he finally stopped asking, not bitter, she said. He'd married a good woman from over the banner by then and was happy, and they were neighbors yet, and on fair terms. The county had watched all this and made of it the sad story of a girl who couldn't let a dead man go. They had it backwards, she told me, and there was steel in it. I wasn't holding onto a dead man. I was holding onto my own word. A person who will break their word the minute it gets hard to keep. What's their word worth on the easy days? I gave you my word on a porch, and I gave you a second thing besides. Do you remember it? You said you waited because you chose to, I said. And if it ever stopped being a thing you chose, you'd tell me plain. Something eased in her face that I'd not seen ease the whole night. You did hear me, she said quietly. I always wondered if you heard that part or just the part you wanted. I heard the part I wanted that night, I admitted. It took me about 4 winters in a camp to hear the rest of it. I had a long while to think over every word you ever said to me, Addie. I got to where I could hear them in your voice. That second thing, I choose this, and I'll tell you plain if I stop, that's the thing I held on to. Not a woman waiting on a shelf for me. A free woman who'd keep choosing as long as the choosing stayed hers. I didn't have any right to a woman waiting on a shelf. But a woman still choosing, I could walk a continent toward the chance of that. I couldn't have walked it toward an obligation. She was quiet a long while. The fire ticked. Outside, the first fine snow of the year had started. I could hear it, that particular nothing sound of snow coming down on snow. Then I'll say the plain thing now, she said at last, because you've earned hearing it and I've earned saying it, and we are neither of us children to dance around a thing. I am 30 years old. I have buried my father and run this place alone and turned down a good man more times than was comfortable. I am not the girl on the porch and you are not the boy who notched those logs. I don't know you, Whit. Not anymore. I know who you were, and I can see the wars made you somebody new and I haven't met him yet. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and fixed me with the clean brown look. So I'm not going to fall into your arms tonight like the end of a storybook, and I'll thank you not to expect it. What I'm going to do is let you stay. You'll sleep in the lean off the barn, it's tight and warm, I keep it for hands at branding. And we are going to court Whit Calloway. At 30 years old, the both of us. We are going to find out, slow and with our eyes open, whether the man you've become and the woman I've become choose each other the way the boy and girl did. And if we do, her voice did not soften but it deepened, which on Addie meant more, if we do, then I'll marry you in the spring in the house I built for it, and that'll be the end of all the leaving either of us'll ever do. And if we don't, if the war broke something in you that won't mend, or if I've gone too hard and alone to fit a man into my days, then we'll find that out kind and honest, and you'll have a place to winter regardless, because I'll not turn a soul out into the snow, least of all you. That's my offer. It's the only one I've got, and it's a fair one. I want to tell you I said something worthy of it. I didn't. I said, yes, ma'am, like a hand taking on it a new outfit, and she laughed, really laughed, the first full laugh I'd had from her in 7 years, and the sound of it went through me like the first warm day after a hard winter. And she said, don't you ma'am me, you fool, go to bed. And I went out through the falling snow to the lean off the barn and lay in the tight warm dark and listened to the horses shift and the snow come down. And for the first time in 7 years, I slept the whole night through, and did not once wake up reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Continuing. So we courted. At 30 years old, through a frontier winter, the strangest and best courting two people ever undertook. I want to set down how it actually went, because the county, when it finally got hold of the story, made it into a thing with a horse coming up the lane at first light, and a woman flying into a dead man's arms, and that is prettier than the truth and a great deal smaller. The truth had more work in it, and the work is what made it hold. I earned my keep first, because a man does, and because she'd not have respected me otherwise, and I'd not have respected myself. That place had been run 7 years by one woman doing the work of 3, and there was a winter's worth of things a second pair of hands could set right, and I set them right. I rehung the barn door that had dropped on its hinges. I dug out and relaid the spring box so the house water ran clean. I broke the 2 young horses she'd not had time to finish, which is a thing I could still do better than most even with a bad shoulder, and watching me do it, watching me gentle a green colt slow and patient, and never once raise a hand or my voice, told her something about the man I'd become that no amount of talking could have. She told me that later. I learned more about who you are now from watching you with that gray colt than from anything you said, she told me. The boy I knew was a fair hand, but he had a temper in him, quick. The man breaking that colt had all the temper burned out and just the patience left. I liked the man. She paused. I needed to know there wasn't a meanness in you the war put there. Some men come back mean. I watched close. You're not mean. You're just careful now and sad in a deep down place, and those a body can live alongside. Mean I'd have sent down the road, war or no war. We talked evenings by the fire the whole long winter. I told her the camp finally, piece by piece, only as much as I could each night and never more, and she never pushed and never flinched and never once said the useless things people say. She just listened and kept my coffee full, and let the silences sit when a thing got too big for words. And slow, across that winter, the deep down sad place in me got not cured. I'll not lie to you that love cures a war, it doesn't, but companied. Less alone. A grief shared out across 2 people sits lighter than the same grief borne by one, and she took up her half of mine without ever once making me feel I'd handed her a burden. And she told me her 7 years, the whole of them. Not the county's sad story version, but the real one with the iron in it. The night she faced the bank. The morning she buried her father in the frozen ground with 3 neighbors and a borrowed preacher. The spring she finally turned the last of Tom Hadley's hopes aside and sat up that night alone wondering if she'd thrown her life away on a notion, the way her own dying father had warned. I had bad nights, she said. I'll not pretend to you I sat here serene and certain 7 years. I had nights I'd have given the place itself to know one way or the other, to know, even if the knowing was that you were dead. The not knowing is the cruelest country there is, wit. A body can grieve a sure thing and come out the far side, but a not knowing has no far side. I lived in it 7 years. She looked at me. So when I tell you I'm glad you're back, know that under it is a thing bigger than glad. It's that I'm out of the not knowing. Whatever we are or aren't to each other now, you brought me out of the worst country I ever lived in, just by riding up that lane alive. I'd have owed you that even if I'd married Tom. We were not the boy and girl on the porch. She'd been right about that. We were 2 people the years had marked and hardened and taught, and the love that came up between us that winter was a different creature than the green quick thing of our 20s, slower, and with both eyes open, and built on the 7 hard years rather than in spite of them. I knew her better at 31, courting her across a fire with snow on the windows, than I'd known her at 24 with my whole heart thrown at her feet. And she knew me, knew the scarred, careful, sad man I'd become, and chose him anyway freely, with the choosing still hers exactly as she'd promised on the porch. The county found out I was back, of course. A strange horse and a man at the Crane place could not stay a secret past the first neighbor riding by, and it was a neighbor, riding by at first light a few mornings on and seeing me crossing the yard with a forkful of hay, who carried the word to town. The Calloway boys come back from the dead. Riz up Addie Crane's lane at first light. And that is how the dawn got into the story and stayed, though I'd come up that lane gray afternoon. A story keeps the detail that sounds best, and a man back from the dead ought to come at dawn. So dawn it became, and I've quit correcting it. The town did not all take it kind. That surprised me, until Addie set me straight on it. There were folks, not many, but loud, who'd built themselves comfortable in the sad story of the jilted girl and the dead soldier. And a sad story is a thing some people would rather keep than have spoiled by a happy ending, because the sad one asks nothing of them, and the happy one makes them wonder what they'd have had the spine to wait for. And there were a few Eli's old cronies, who muttered that I'd a nerve coming back after 7 years of silence to a woman I'd let grieve me, and that she'd be a fool to take me, and hadn't her own father warned her, and so on. The loudest of these was a man named Vard Petty, a big land-proud rancher who'd had his own eye on the Crane bottomland for years and his own notions about buying it cheap off a woman alone, and who'd not forgiven her the bank business, nor the turning aside of every match he'd tried to broker to men who'd have sold him the land after. Petty stood up in the mercantile one Saturday. I had it from 3 witnesses, the storekeeper foremost, who'd gone from ash-faced stranger-fearer to my staunchest partisan, once he'd worked out I was no ghost, and held forth that Adeline Crane was making a fool of herself and the whole county over a saddled tramp who'd come back broke and broken to live off a woman's good land, and that someone ought to tell her so for her own sake. Word of it reached the creek by nightfall, the way such word does. Now here is the part I am proudest of, and it is not a part where I do anything, which I have come to think is the whole point of it. I wanted to ride into town and find Vard Petty and settle it the old way, the way the boy who notched those logs would have, with fists or worse. I had the temper up in me for the first time since I'd come home, and I was halfway to the corral for my horse when Addie came out onto the porch, our porch, the new one on the house she'd built, and said my name once, sharp. "Where are you going?" "To town," I said, "to have a word with Vard Petty about your name." "No," she said, "you're not." I turned around. "Addie, he stood up in a public store and called you a fool and me I know what he called us. I've been called worse by better men than Vard Petty, and so I expect have you." She came down the steps. "Wit, listen to me, because this is important and I need you to hear all of it and not just the part you want, like a porch 7 years gone." She stopped in front of me. "If you ride into town and beat Vard Petty bloody over my name, here is what the county learns. They learn that the sad story was right, that I'm a woman who needs a man to come fight her battles, and that the man I waited for is a hard case who solves things with his fists, just like Eli's cronies said. You'll have proved every ugly thing they whispered, with your own 2 hands, and you'll have done it for me, which makes me the cause of it, which takes from me the one thing I have spent 7 years and a great deal of blood keeping, which is the respect of this valley as a woman who stands on her own feet. I did not face down that bank and bury my father and run this place alone for 7 years to have you hand the county a reason to call me a helpless girl after all. Do you understand me?" I stood in the cold yard and understood that I had very nearly, out of love, done her the worst harm anyone had done her in 7 years. "Then what?" I said. "I'm to let him talk." "You're to let me answer it," she said, "in my own way, on my own ground, the way I've answered every other thing these 7 years. And you're to stand beside me while I do it, not in front of me, beside me, because that's the marriage I'm offering and the other kind I'd not have on a bet." She looked up at me. "Can you do that? It's harder than hitting Vard Petty. A great deal harder for a man like you. Can you stand beside a woman and let her fight her own fight and not step in front?" I have thought since that this was the truest test she ever set me, harder than the colt, harder than the long talking. Because every instinct the war and the world had drilled into me said a man protects his woman with his body and his fists, steps in front, settles it. And she was asking me to learn a different thing, that the deepest protection I could offer Adeline Crane was to honor her strength instead of overriding it, to stand beside and not before, to let her be the largest thing in her own life, which she had earned 1,000 times over, instead of making myself the largest thing in it the day I rode back. I can learn too, I said. I'll get it wrong sometimes. I've a lifetime of getting it the other way. But I can learn too if you'll tell me plain when I start to step in front. I'll tell you plain, she said. I've never had any trouble telling you plain. And she didn't. Lord help me, she never did. What she did about Vard Petty I will carry to my grave with pride, and I had no hand in it but to stand beside her as she'd asked. The next Saturday she drove the wagon into Calder's Bluff, and I rode alongside, and she went into the mercantile at the busy hour when half the county was in town, and she did her trading calm and unhurried while the talk dropped off around her and folks pretended not to watch. And when Vard Petty came in, as she'd known he would, big and loud, she finished counting her change, and then she turned around and faced him across that crowded store, and she spoke in the flat, plain, carrying voice I'd heard her run a branding with. "Mr. Petty," she said, "I'm told you stood in this store last Saturday and called me a fool over my own private business. I've come to give you the chance to say it to my face, since you've so much to say about me behind it." The store went dead quiet. Petty colored up and blustered something about a woman's own good and not letting herself be taken advantage of by a man who walked across a continent to come home to me, she said, cutting clean through it. "Mr. Petty, let me tell you what you actually object to, since you've not the honesty to name it yourself. You've wanted this bottomland 8 years. You wanted it when my father had it, and you wanted it cheaper when he died, and you've been disappointed every season I've kept it out of your hands, run better than your place for all your hired men. What galls you is not that I'm a fool. What galls you is that I am not, and never have been. And you can't abide a woman who won't be bought, married off, or starved out of land you've decided ought to be yours. That's the whole of it, and every soul in this store who's done business with the both of us knows it." She picked up her parcel. "I waited 7 years for a good man because I chose to, and he came home, and I am going to marry him this spring in the house I built with my own earnings on the land I kept out of your reach. You're welcome at the wedding, Mr. Petty, if you can manage to come and not be small. And if you can't," she settled her bonnet, "then you can stay home and chew on the fact that Adeline Crane was never once in 8 years the fool in this valley. Good day." And she walked out, and I held the door for her and followed her, behind her, this once on purpose, because the whole store needed to see that the man stood back and let her have her own ground. And the storekeeper told me after that the silence held a good 10 seconds, and then somebody laughed. And then half the store was laughing at Vard Petty, who had been answered so square and so true by a woman alone that there was not one thing left for him to say, and who put on his hat and went out the back and was, the storekeeper swore, a noticeably quieter man in that county forever after. That is how Adeline Crane fought her own fight, and I learned, standing back and watching her win it with nothing but the plain truth spoken in a crowded store, more about what it is to honor a woman than I'd learned in 31 years of meaning to protect them. We married in the spring. Continuing. I'll not make a long, pretty scene of the wedding, because she'd not have wanted one, and the truth of it was plain and good. We married in the big room of the house she'd built, in front of its creekstone hearth, under the dressed fir mantle I'd felled the autumn I rode off, with maybe 20 neighbors crowded in, the storekeeper and his wife, Tom Hadley and the good woman he'd wed, who came with open hearts and no awkwardness because they were large enough souls not to carry any, and a dozen others who decided, the way a county does all at once, that the happy ending was after all a finer thing to have witnessed than the sad story they'd been telling. The borrowed preacher who'd buried her father came back to marry her, and said before he started that it did his old heart good to come up that lane for a glad reason after the hard one, and I saw Addie's eyes go bright at that, the only time all day. She wore her mother's dress, made over to fit, plain and well. She did not cry coming down the short stair, and she did not cry through the vows, and when the preacher got to the part about till death and I felt the whole 7 years and the 4 winters and the long road rise up in me, it was her hand that tightened on mine, steadying me, the way she'd steadied a trembling man at a gate in the autumn. And when it was done and I kissed her once, gentle, in front of God and the county and Tom Hadley's kind eyes, there was a sound from the neighbors like a held breath let go. 7 years of a county's held breath let go all at once. And then somebody had a fiddle out and the tables were carried in and we were married. And the door of the house she'd built stood open to the spring. And the old coat still hung on its peg by it, and would hang there yet for years. Not as a shrine now, but as a thing we both walked past a dozen times a day without a word, the two of us knowing what it had meant and not needing to say. That was a long time ago. I am an old man now, setting this down at the kitchen table, by the window that looks on the creek, where she said to put it so a body could watch the water while they worked. She is out at the garden as I write this, slower than she was. We both are, but straight-backed yet, plain and certain yet, gray all through her hair now and her hands harder than ever and dearer to me than the day they lay flat and warm on my chest at a cold gate and forgave me a war. We raised 3 on this place. We brought it through more winters, and a drought that near broke us, and the deaths of neighbors and the births of their grandchildren. And we did it the way she'd laid out on the porch the first night I came home, beside each other, neither one in front, her fighting her fights and me fighting mine, and the two of us standing shoulder to shoulder against the weather of the world. I have thought a great deal in my old age about the 7 years, about whether they were a cruelty or a gift. A cruelty they surely were in the living of them, her not knowing, my silence, the letters the war ate, the father who died thinking her a fool. I'd not wish those years on anyone and I'd undo the suffering in them if I could. But I have come to believe they gave us a thing an easier road would not have. They proved us. They proved her word was iron and not pretty talk. They proved my coming home was a choice and not a habit. They proved that what we'd felt on a porch at 24 could survive 7 years of the worst the world had, and come out the far side not green and easy, but deep and true and chosen with both eyes open. A great many couples marry on the strength of a feeling, and never once find out whether the feeling would have held against real weather. We found out before we ever wed, we found out the hard way, across 7 years and a continent, and the finding out is the bedrock the whole long good life was built on. The county still tells the story sometimes, the young ones who weren't born then, and they tell it the pretty way, the woman who waited, the dead man come home, the horse up the lane at first light. And I let them. It's not wrong exactly. It's just smaller than the truth, the way the pretty version of a thing always is. The truth is larger, and it is hers more than mine. The truth is a woman who did not wait the way the word means in storybooks, pinning, fatting, less of herself each year. The truth is a woman who expected, which is a verb, an active and a stubborn and a clear-eyed thing, who built a house and kept a homestead and faced a bank and buried a father and answered a county and turned aside a good man, all the while keeping a door oiled and a coat on its peg and her own free word unbroken, not because she was anyone's to keep, but because the keeping of it was hers to choose. The truth is that when I finally came up that lane, broken and scarred and 7 years too late, she did not fall into my arms like the end of a storybook. She said, "You're late," and then she made me court her like a grown man, and let me earn my way back into a life she'd built strong enough to stand without me, and then chose me anyway freely, the choosing still hers exactly as she'd promised a green boy on a porch a lifetime ago. I rode a long road home to a woman I thought I was rescuing from a sad waiting. I have had a whole good life since to understand the truth of it, which is the other way round and finer. She was never waiting to be rescued. She was standing in the door of a house she'd built, holding her own word like a lamp in a window, expecting. And what she gave me, when I finally came up that lane, was not the relief of being someone's rescuer. It was the far greater thing of being chosen, with open eyes, by the strongest soul I ever knew. The door is still open. She's coming up from the garden now. I can hear her on the path, that same plain, certain step, 7 winters and 40 lost letters, and a whole long life of mornings between that gate and this one.